In the grand halls of European royalty, where tradition runs deeper than bloodlines and protocol governs every breath, there exists one rule that has never been written in any royal handbook. It's a rule born not from ceremony, but from a single moment that shattered two lives forever. Every photograph, every public appearance, every state dinner, if you look closely enough, you'll see him. Standing 3 steps behind, eyes scanning the crowd, hand resting near his weapon. Captain Marcus Blackwood, the royal guard who has never, not once in 12 years, left Princess Isabella's side during any public engagement. The media calls it devotion. The palace calls it duty. The truth is far more devastating. What the cameras don't capture is the slight tremor in his hands every time someone approaches her too quickly. What the newspapers don't report is how he still wakes up screaming her name. Not in passion, but in terror. What the royal biographers will never know is that Marcus Blackwood isn't protecting a princess. He's trying to save the woman he failed to protect when it mattered most. This is the story of a promise made in blood, a love that defied every law of the crown, and a tragedy so profound it rewrote the very meaning of loyalty. This is the story of why a man will spend his entire life standing in the shadows, watching over the one person he can never have, but can never lose again. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding someone close. Sometimes it's making sure they never know how completely you failed them once before. The first time Marcus Blackwood saw Princess Isabella, she was hanging upside down from an oak tree, her royal blue dress tangled in the branches, cursing like a sailor while her governess stood below, wringing her hands in horror. He was 22, fresh from military academy, and had been assigned to the royal grounds as a junior guard. She was 17, wild as a spring storm, and absolutely forbidden territory. "Are you going to help me down? Or just stand there grinning like an idiot?" she called out, her face red from hanging inverted, auburn hair cascading toward the ground like a waterfall of fire. Marcus had been trained for many scenarios during his military service. Terrorist attacks, assassination attempts, crowd control, diplomatic emergencies. Nobody had prepared him for a princess stuck in a tree who looked at him like he was just another person, not a servant to be ignored or a threat to be managed. "Your Highness," he said formally, though his lips twitched with suppressed laughter, "I believe protocol requires me to fetch a ladder and alert your security detail." "Protocol can kiss my royal behind," Isabella shot back. "I've been hanging here for 10 minutes while Miss Cromwell has vapors. Just give me your hand." That was Isabella in a nutshell. Royal blood, common sense, and a mouth that could make a dock worker blush. Marcus had grown up in the working-class districts of Manchester, earned his commission through merit rather than breeding, and had never met anyone quite like her. She was supposed to be untouchable, unreachable, as distant from his world as the stars. Instead, she was hanging from a tree branch, looking at him like he was her salvation. He helped her down. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the air between them. Isabella felt it too. He could see in the way her breath caught, how her eyes lingered on his face a moment longer than proper. When her feet touched the ground, she didn't immediately let go of his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. And for just a moment, she wasn't a princess. She was just a girl who'd gotten herself into trouble and needed someone to help her out. That should have been the end of it. A minor incident, quickly forgotten, filed away in the endless catalog of royal mishaps that never made it to the newspapers. But the next day, Isabella sought him out. "I want to learn self-defense," she announced, cornering him during his patrol of the palace gardens. Marcus nearly choked on his morning coffee. "Your Highness, I'm sure there are proper instructors." "I don't want a proper instructor," she interrupted. "I want you to teach me. You're military trained. You know real fighting, not the dancing master nonsense they usually assign to royalty." "Princess, I don't think. It's not a request, Mr. Blackwood." And there was the royal authority that could move mountains and reshape kingdoms, delivered with a smile that could stop traffic, and eyes that saw right through every excuse he might offer. Marcus knew he should refuse, should cite protocol, proper channels, the dozen different ways this could go wrong. Instead, he heard himself saying, "When would you like to start?" Your Highness? They began meeting 3 times a week in the palace gymnasium, officially sanctioned training sessions with proper chaperones and carefully maintained distances. Isabella proved to be a natural athlete, quick, determined, unafraid of getting bruised or sweaty or looking less than perfectly royal. She threw herself into the lessons with the same passionate intensity she brought to everything else in her life. Marcus tried to keep things professional. He really did. But Isabella made it impossible. She asked about his life, his family, his dreams beyond the palace walls. She listened when he talked about growing up poor, about earning his way in a military school, about wanting to make something meaningful of his life. She shared her own frustrations, the suffocating weight of royal expectations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw a crown instead of a person, the fear that she'd never be allowed to make choices about her own life. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked one afternoon after a particularly intense sparring session, both of them breathing hard and covered in sweat, to have every decision made for you before you're even born? What you'll study, who you'll marry, how you'll spend every moment of your life. They were sitting on a gymnasium floor, backs against the wall, sharing a water bottle in casual intimacy that would have scandalized the entire palace if anyone had seen. Marcus watched the way late afternoon sunlight caught the copper threads in her hair, the way she twisted her hands when she talked about things that mattered to her. "I chose to join the military," he said carefully. "I chose to apply for royal service. Not many choices, maybe, but they were mine. I envy that," Isabella said quietly. "More than you know. You're the princess of one of the most powerful nations in Europe," Marcus pointed out. "You have everything anyone could want." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have everything except the one thing that matters. Freedom to choose my own path." That conversation changed something between them. What had started as professional courtesy and mutual respect began to deepen into something more dangerous. Marcus told himself it was just friendship, just two people from different worlds finding common ground. But friendship didn't explain the way his heart raced when she smiled at him, the way he looked forward to their training sessions more than anything else in his life, the way he lay awake at night thinking about the sound of her laugh. For Isabella, Marcus represented everything the palace walls couldn't contain. He was real in a way that nothing else in her life felt real. He didn't bow and scrape and tell her what she wanted to hear. He challenged her, pushed her to be stronger, treated her like she was capable of more than just looking pretty and waving at crowds. When she was with him, she forgot about protocols and expectations and royal bloodlines. She was just Isabella, and that was enough. The breaking point came 6 months after they'd started training together. Isabella had convinced him to extend one of their sessions, and they'd ended up sparring well past sunset. The gymnasium was empty, the chaperones long gone, and they were alone in a way they'd never been before. Isabella had just successfully executed a throw that sent Marcus sprawling onto the mats. She hooped in triumph, offering him a hand up, but when he took it, the momentum pulled her down instead. She landed on top of him, both of them laughing until suddenly they weren't. They were just looking at each other, faces inches apart, breathing the same air, and all the careful distance they'd maintained for months collapsed in an instant. Marcus knew he should move, should apologize, should restore the proper boundaries between them. Instead, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Isabella's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned closer. "This is a terrible idea," Marcus whispered. "The worst," Isabella agreed, and then she kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as months of suppressed feelings poured out between them. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. Marcus could feel the weight of everything they'd just destroyed, his career, her reputation, the careful order of the world they lived in. "Isabella," he started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me why this is impossible. I know all the reasons. I've known them my entire life. Just for tonight, can we pretend they don't matter?" So they did. They pretended that love was stronger than duty, that two people could choose each other regardless of the circumstances they were born into. They pretended that the world outside the gymnasium walls didn't exist, that there were no cameras or protocols or royal obligations waiting for them. They spent the next 3 hours talking and kissing and planning impossible futures. Marcus told her about a little house he'd seen in the countryside, with a garden where she could grow flowers without anyone photographing them. Isabella talked about traveling to places not because duty demanded it, but because she wanted to see them. They built castles in the air and convinced themselves for a few precious hours that love might actually be enough. It wasn't until the palace bells chimed midnight that reality came crashing back. Isabella had missed dinner with the Danish ambassador. Her private secretary had been frantically searching for her. The queen had been informed of her absence. "I have to go," Isabella said, but she didn't move from where she was curled against Marcus's chest. "I know," he replied, but his arms tightened around her. They both knew that walking out of that gymnasium would change everything. The stolen moments, the pretense, the brief illusion that they could have something real together. It would all disappear the moment they returned to their designated roles. "Marcus," Isabella said quietly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that tonight, this is the most real thing I've ever felt." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair one last time. "I love you, Isabella. I know I shouldn't, but I do. I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "More than I ever thought possible." They walked back to the palace separately, maintaining careful distance, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just a princess and her guard. They were two people in love, surrounded by a world determined to keep them apart. Neither of them knew that their stolen evening together had been witnessed, that photographs had been taken, that even as they said good night with careful formality in the palace corridors, wheels were already turning that would tear their lives apart within days. The last thing Marcus saw before closing his eyes that night was Isabella's smile as she looked at him in the gymnasium. The memory of her saying she loved him. The impossible dream of a future where love might actually win. He would remember that smile for the rest of his life, because in just 72 hours, he would watch it disappear forever, replaced by something that would haunt his nightmares and drive him to make a promise that would define every moment of his remaining days. The storm was coming, but for one perfect night, Marcus Blackwood and Princess Isabella had found something worth fighting for. Even if they didn't yet understand the price they would pay to keep it point 3 days after their night in the gymnasium, Marcus knew something was wrong the moment he arrived for duty. The other guards wouldn't meet his eyes. His supervisor, Colonel Hayes, was nowhere to be seen, and Princess Isabella had canceled their scheduled training session without explanation. He found out why at precisely 9:47 a.m., when every newspaper in the kingdom hit the stands with the same devastating headline: Royal Scandal. Princess Isabella's secret romance with Commoner Guard. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. Isabella and Marcus in the gymnasium, kissing, her hands tangled in his hair, his arms wrapped around her waist. Someone had been watching them, waiting with a camera for exactly the moment when their careful pretenses crumbled. The accompanying article was a masterpiece of sensationalism and barely concealed class warfare, painting Marcus as an opportunistic social climber who had seduced an innocent princess for personal gain. Marcus was reading the damning words when Colonel Hayes appeared beside him, his face grim as granite. "My office. Now." The walk down the corridor felt like a funeral march. Other staff members stepped aside as they passed, some with sympathetic looks, others with the barely hidden satisfaction of watching someone fall from grace. Marcus had never realized how precarious his position really was until it was crumbling beneath his feet. Colonel Hayes closed the office door with deliberate care, then turned to face Marcus with the expression of a man about to perform an execution. "Explain," he said simply. "Sir, 24 hours ago, you were one of the most promising young officers in royal service," Hayes interrupted. "Today, you're front-page news in 17 countries. The Queen's private secretary has been fielding calls since 6 a.m. from every major media outlet in Europe. The Danish ambassador has expressed concern about the princess's fitness for the upcoming state marriage negotiations. 3 members of parliament have called for your immediate dismissal and possible charges of conduct unbecoming. So I'll ask you again, explain. Marcus straightened his shoulders, falling back on military bearing because it was all he had left. I take full responsibility for my actions, sir. That's not what I asked. Marcus stopped, struggled to find words for something that defied explanation. How could he make Colonel Hayes understand what Isabella meant to him? How could he explain that what had happened between them wasn't calculated seduction, but something pure and desperate and real? Did you or did you not engage in an inappropriate relationship with Princess Isabella? Hayes asked. The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Marcus knew that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but Isabella's as well. If he claimed it was one-sided, that he had misinterpreted her kindness and overstepped his bounds, he might be able to shield her from the worst of the scandal. It would destroy his reputation completely, but it might save hers. Yes, sir, Marcus said quietly. I did. Hayes nodded grimly. Then, you leave me no choice. You're dismissed from royal service, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises within the hour. You're forbidden from any contact with members of the royal family, and you'll sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before you leave. Colonel, this is a negotiation, Blackwood. You've compromised the security and reputation of the crown. You're finished here. Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows. Royal service hadn't just been a job. It had been his identity, his purpose, his entire adult life. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed to achieve, was being stripped away because he'd fallen in love with the wrong person. What about Princess Isabella? He asked. Hayes's expression darkened. That's no longer your concern. She doesn't deserve to be punished for this. If anyone should face consequences, it should be me. I was the one in a position of authority. I was the one who should have maintained proper boundaries. Your concern for the princess is noted and completely irrelevant, Hayes said coldly. She will face her own consequences through the proper channels. Your job now is to disappear quietly and hope this doesn't follow you for the rest of your career. Marcus started to protest, to argue that Isabella's feelings mattered, that she wasn't some helpless victim to be managed by men in suits. But the look on Hayes's face stopped him. This conversation was over. His life, as he'd known it, was over. The next hour passed in a blur of bureaucratic humiliation. Security guards stood over him as he packed his few personal belongings. Legal representatives appeared with documents to sign, agreements that would prevent him from ever speaking publicly about his time in royal service, about anything he'd witnessed or experienced, about Isabella. The non-disclosure agreement was so comprehensive that it essentially erased 3 years of his life from the historical record. What happens if I refuse to sign? Marcus asked. The lawyer smiled thinly. Criminal charges for breach of national security, civil suits for defamation and loss of royal reputation, financial ruin, prison time. The choice is yours, Mr. Blackwood. Marcus signed every document they put in front of him. What choice did he have? Fighting would only make things worse for Isabella, and she was the only thing that mattered now. As security escorted him toward the palace gates, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upper windows. Isabella stood there, still as a statue, watching him leave. Even from a distance, he could see that she'd been crying. Their eyes met for just an instant across the courtyard. One last moment of connection before the machinery of royal protocol separated them forever. Marcus wanted to call out to her, to tell her that none of this was her fault, that he would have made the same choices again in a heartbeat. Instead, he pressed his hand to his heart and held her gaze until the gates closed between them. He never saw her look away. The media-feeding frenzy that followed was unlike anything in recent royal history. Every detail of Marcus's life was dissected and displayed for public consumption. His working-class background, his military record, his family's modest circumstances, everything was twisted into evidence of his unsuitability for association with royalty. Reporters camped outside his parents' house, offering money for exclusive interviews and photographs. His younger sister was followed to university by paparazzi, hoping to catch her in some compromising situation. Marcus retreated to a small flat in the outer London boroughs and watched his life become entertainment for millions of strangers. The tabloids painted him as everything from a calculating fortune hunter to a dangerous obsessive who had manipulated an innocent princess. The truth, that two people had simply fallen in love despite the circumstances keeping them apart, was apparently too mundane for headlines. But the real torture wasn't the media attention or the destroyed career prospects. It was the complete silence from the palace. No word about Isabella's condition, her state of mind, how she was coping with the scandal. Marcus was cut off from any information about the person he loved most in the world, left to piece together fragments from newspaper reports that focused more on speculation than facts. He learned from the gossip columns that Isabella had been confined to the palace for her own protection, that she'd been assigned new security personnel and a new private secretary, that the training gymnasium had been converted to a flower arrangement room, effectively erasing any trace of the time they'd spent together. Most devastating of all, he read that negotiations for Isabella's arranged marriage to Prince Henrik of Denmark had been accelerated in response to recent events. The engagement would be announced within 6 months, the wedding scheduled for the following spring. Isabella was being married off as quickly as possible, before any more scandals could emerge. Marcus tried to find ways to contact her, to let her know that he was thinking of her, that he didn't regret what had happened between them despite the consequences. But the palace had closed ranks completely. Letters were returned unopened. Phone calls were blocked. Even indirect messages through mutual acquaintances disappeared into the void of royal protocol. The isolation was almost unbearable. For months, Marcus had woken up every morning with purpose, protecting and serving someone he cared about, spending time with Isabella, building something meaningful with his life. Now his days stretched empty and purposeless before him. He took a job with a private security firm, work that paid well, but felt hollow after the significance of royal service. Late at night, when the city was quiet and sleep wouldn't come, Marcus found himself walking past the palace gates. He told himself he was just out for air, just clearing his head, but he always ended up in the same spot, looking up at the windows where Isabella might be, wondering if she ever thought about him, if she was as heartbroken as he was. It was during one of these midnight vigils, about 6 weeks after the scandal broke, that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The palace security had been increased, but not in the usual way. There were more guards, yes, but they weren't positioned to keep people out. They were positioned to keep someone in. Princess Isabella was essentially under house arrest in her own home. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. She wasn't being protected from media attention or overzealous admirers. She was being imprisoned, kept isolated until the scandal died down, and she could be married off to Prince Henrik without causing further embarrassment to the crown. Marcus stood outside those gates, fists clenched, heart pounding with rage and helplessness. The woman he loved was trapped inside those walls, probably as desperate for contact with the outside world as he was for contact with her. And there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. That was the night Marcus Blackwood made the first of 2 promises that would define the rest of his life. Standing in the shadow of the palace that had cast them both out, he swore that he would find a way back. Somehow, some way, he would return to Isabella's side. He would become someone the palace couldn't dismiss or ignore. He would make himself indispensable, untouchable, too valuable to cast aside. He didn't know how long it would take or what he would have to sacrifice to achieve it. He only knew that the alternative, a life without Isabella, leaving her to face whatever came next alone, was unacceptable. The second promise would come later, born from tragedy and soaked in blood and regret. But that first promise, made in love and desperation outside the palace gates, was the beginning of everything that followed. Marcus Blackwood was going to find his way back to Princess Isabella's side. And once he got there, he was never going to leave again, even if it killed him. Marcus Blackwood was no longer the naive young man who had been escorted from the palace gates 5 years earlier. The man who returned to royal service had been forged in the crucible of elite military operations, private security consulting, and a determination that bordered on obsession. After his dismissal from the palace, Marcus had done something that surprised everyone who knew him. He'd requested immediate deployment to the most dangerous military assignment available. Within 3 months of the scandal, he was deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, part of an elite special forces unit conducting operations that didn't officially exist. For 2 years, he threw himself into missions that killed or broke most men, earning a reputation for reckless bravery that his commanding officers couldn't decide was heroic or suicidal. When he finally returned to England, Marcus was decorated, hardened, and carrying skills that made him one of the most sought-after security specialists in Europe. He spent the next 3 years working for private firms, protecting billionaires, politicians, and celebrities whose lives were constantly under threat. He learned advanced surveillance techniques, threat assessment, counterintelligence operations. He became fluent in 4 languages, expert in weapon systems most military personnel never saw, and developed an almost supernatural ability to read danger in crowds. Every skill he acquired, every contact he made, every success he achieved was calculated with one goal in mind: becoming so valuable, so indispensable, that the royal household would have no choice but to bring him back. The opportunity came when Colonel Hayes retired, and the palace began searching for a new head of royal protection. The position required someone with impeccable military credentials, advanced security training, and experience with high-profile international assignments. On paper, Marcus Blackwood was the most qualified candidate they'd had in decades. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The man they'd expelled in disgrace had spent 5 years becoming exactly what they needed most. The interview process was grueling, designed to find any weakness or lingering trace of the scandal that had ended his previous employment. Marcus sat through hours of psychological evaluation, background investigation, and hypothetical scenario testing. He answered every question with professional detachment, never mentioning Isabella by name, never showing any emotion beyond dedicated competence. "Mr. Blackwood," the palace interviewer said during his final evaluation, "you understand that this position would require you to interact regularly with all members of the royal family. Given your previous experience here, are you confident you can maintain appropriate professional boundaries?" Marcus met the man's gaze steadily. "Sir, I made serious errors in judgment during my previous service that I deeply regret. I've spent the last 5 years learning from those mistakes and developing the skills necessary to serve the crown with the dedication and professionalism it deserves. If offered this position, my personal feelings would never again interfere with my duties." It was simultaneously the truth and a complete lie. His personal feelings were exactly why he wanted the position, but 5 years of military discipline had taught him how to bury those feelings beneath layers of professional competence. He could love Isabella and protect her without letting one emotion compromise the other. At least, that's what he told himself. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Marcus was offered the position of Senior Royal Protection Officer, effective immediately. He would be responsible for coordinating security for all major royal events, with particular focus on Princess Isabella's protection detail. "Princess Isabella, specifically?" Marcus asked, fighting to keep his voice neutral. "She's been receiving increased threats recently," the palace administrator explained. Anonymous letters, disturbing packages sent to the palace, individuals attempting to breach security at public events. "Her current detail is adequate for routine protection, but we need someone with your specialized skills to assess and counter more sophisticated threats." Marcus accepted the position before the man finished speaking. 3 days later, he walked through the palace gates for the first time in 5 years. Everything looked exactly the same. The same guards, the same protocols, the same marble corridors that had once felt like home. But Marcus himself was completely different. Where once there had been an eager young man desperate to prove himself, now there was a professional who moved through the world like a predator, constantly assessing threats and calculating responses. He was reviewing security files in his new office when she walked in. "Hello, Marcus." 5 years disappeared in an instant. Isabella stood in his doorway, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed professional facade crack like ice under sudden pressure. She was 25 now, no longer the wild girl who had hung from tree branches and cursed like a sailor. Her beauty had matured into something that literally took his breath away. Elegant, refined, but with the same fire in her eyes that had captivated him from the beginning. "Your Highness," Marcus said, rising from his desk and offering a formal bow that felt like swallowing broken glass. Isabella closed the door behind her and leaned against it, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to either run or grab her and never let go. "You look different," she said quietly. "So do you." They stood there for a long moment, two people who had once known each other's dreams and fears reduced to polite strangers by 5 years and the weight of royal protocol. Marcus could see that Isabella wanted to say more, could feel the tension radiating from her like heat, but they both knew that too much had changed for easy intimacy. "I requested you specifically for my security detail," Isabella said finally. Marcus felt his heart skip. "Why?" "Because I trust you. Because despite everything that happened, despite the scandal and the consequences, I know you would die before letting anyone hurt me." She paused, her voice becoming softer. "And because I've missed you every single day for 5 years. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible divide. Marcus wanted to cross that bridge, wanted to tell her that he'd missed her too, that thinking of her had been the only thing that kept him alive during the darkest moments in Afghanistan, that his love for her had only grown stronger during their separation. Instead, he said, "I won't let my personal feelings interfere with my professional responsibilities." Isabella's face fell almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, I wouldn't expect anything else." But as she turned to leave, she stopped at the door and looked back at him. "Marcus, for what it's worth, I don't regret what happened between us. Not a moment of it. Not even knowing what it cost us." Then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with the devastating realization that 5 years of military discipline and professional training hadn't diminished his feelings for her at all. If anything, the separation had made them stronger, more desperate, more impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into his new responsibilities with the same obsessive dedication he'd once applied to military operations. He reviewed every aspect of Isabella's security protocols, identified weaknesses in the existing arrangements, and implemented improvements that made her one of the most protected individuals in Europe. He accompanied her to charity events, state dinners, and public appearances, always maintaining perfect professional distance, while his heart hammered against his ribs every time someone in the crowd moved too quickly or called out her name too loudly. The threats against her were real. Disturbing letters that detailed intimate knowledge of her daily routine, photographs taken with telephoto lenses from impossible angles, packages containing items that suggested the sender had access to places they shouldn't. Marcus coordinated with intelligence services, upgraded palace security systems, and personally trained every guard assigned to Isabella's detail. He became the shadow that followed her everywhere, invisible until needed, always watching, always ready. Isabella, for her part, seemed to accept their new dynamic with resigned professionalism. She never again mentioned their past relationship or her feelings for him. She treated him with polite courtesy, followed his security recommendations without question, and maintained the careful distance that protocol demanded. But Marcus noticed things that protocol couldn't hide. The way her eyes found his in crowded rooms, seeking reassurance or connection. How she relaxed almost imperceptibly when he was near, her shoulders losing tension she carried everywhere else. The way she sometimes started to say his name the old way, just Marcus instead of Mr. Blackwood, before catching herself. And he noticed something else, something that filled him with both joy and heartbreak. Isabella wasn't married. The engagement to Prince Henrik had been quietly dissolved 2 years earlier, officially due to irreconcilable differences, but really because Isabella had refused to go through with it. According to palace gossip, she told her parents that she would rather abdicate her titles than marry someone she didn't love. The standoff had been epic, involving shouting matches that could be heard through palace walls and threats from both sides that nearly caused a constitutional crisis. Isabella had won, but the victory had cost her dearly. She was now considered difficult by other European royal families, making future marriage arrangements nearly impossible. The press speculated constantly about her single status, alternately painting her as tragically romantic or dangerously rebellious. Marcus understood that her refusal to marry was connected to what had happened between them. She'd chosen to remain alone rather than settle for someone she didn't love, just as he'd spent 5 years becoming someone worthy of protecting her. They were both trapped by their feelings for each other, unable to be together, but equally unable to move on. The realization of what Isabella had sacrificed for their impossible love made Marcus's second promise inevitable. Standing guard outside her bedroom door late one night, listening to her pace restlessly inside while he maintained his silent vigil in the corridor, Marcus swore that he would never again let his personal feelings put her in danger. He would protect her with his life, but he would never again risk her happiness or her position for the sake of what they felt for each other. She had already given up too much. He wouldn't let her sacrifice anything else. It was a promise born from love and sealed with heartbreak, and Marcus intended to keep it no matter what it cost him personally. He just didn't know that within days, that promise would be tested in ways he never imagined. That loving someone sometimes means making choices that destroy you both, and that the greatest act of protection can look, from the outside, like the cruelest form of abandonment. The real test was coming, and this time, the stakes would be measured not in scandal or career consequences, but in blood.